Personal Philosophy, Part 3. Existentialism. Well, if there's an analogy to be made with the ways of looking at existence, questions about it, and by questions I don't mean, is it possible for God to create a burrito so hot that even he could not eat it? I mean questions like why? I mean questions like how? If there is an analogy to be made in the ways of expressing questions like that, the means by which the answers are speculated at or derived, it would be kind of like the standard model of particle physics when they have their little, the fact that the periodic table is periodic and it turns out the standard model is also periodic. So there is a periodicity to existentialism being the lowest energy state, and if there's a higher energy density state, you have a different like in the same period but a different type of similar but different kind of thing. So for the analogy, it would be like you've got the electron, the muon, and the tauon, right? Each of them is the electromagnetic force carrying particle for their respective energy density, the conditions at which they are able to exist. And in any circumstances in which those particles exist, it appears that these are just increasingly more massive versions of electron. So electron is existentialism. There are things like nihilism, absurdism, that kind of are not in the same, you know, they are different states of different energy levels, I guess is what I'm getting at. So what I'm looking at is predominantly absurdism. I used to have a thing all the time, a lot of people, as I was like studying, researching, reading, exploring, trying to consume any and all information about the nature of reality and try and, come to my own conclusion. Eventually involved, being able to unlearn and disregard certain information too. Not because it didn't fit, but because it wasn't true. People would come up to me in large numbers, and just not all the time at large numbers, but just a large number of people over time would come up to me and all say the same thing, the exact same thing, word for word, with pretty much the same intonation. Something about wanting to talk to me about existentialism and philosophy. They liked my views. Well, existentialism is, I believe, the debate, speculation, and question about whether or not we exist. Well, it's kind of a... Once you reach a certain point, existentialism is not only not the word for it, but existentialism is playing with Duplos and nubby crayons when it comes to thinking about things like that. Because you take it in the context and the lens of existentialism as a school of thought, 36 of us exist, and the rest of you do not. Nihilism, although not the only of the middle of the period, the in between when you get to absurdism, which is more akin to the truth, and other ones whose words I probably can't remember, is a vast school of thought that ultimately kind of comes to the idea that none of it matters anyway. And when you humble yourself before the cosmos or whatever, yeah, that's kind of what it feels like. But the problem with that is it leads to things like despair and hopelessness. So instead, I like to look at things like absurdism. Because as I've said, they seem to be more true like that. The more absurd an idea is, the more likely it is to be true. The absurdity of the idea is subjective, depending on the person. You see. Oftentimes, absurdism was just a bunch of smart people that could see what was going on around them and try as they might, couldn't make a dent in the wall of stupid out there. So there's this kind of pseudo-joke philosophy. It's kind of one of those things like Discordianism as a serious religion. There are people who seriously practice Discordianism because they need to practice a religion. Probably not so much anymore because now the new religion is wokeness. But basically, you've got this idea that the more absurd something seems to be, the more true it tends to be. The reason for this mostly being because the individual being shown a thing feels that it is absurd because they cannot handle the truth, which is why absurdism as a school of thought is so much more akin to the truth. You seek the things that seem absurd and you find out whether or not they're real, how they could be possible. Are they actually real? So when I say most people don't exist, it's because most people are simulated. And my guess is something like between 36 and 936 real minds exist. And all the rest of them are just fractal, holographic, harmonic reiterations to fill space. Or maybe there's a function beyond what I can understand. But they're there, but they're not real people. So basically, what I'm getting at is the simulation is all that we can be aware of. You can call it the universe if you like, but the reality is the unescapable truth is that if you're creating a simulation of any sort, you have to cut corners to create a microcosm instead of a duplicate copycosm. The amount of computation power necessary to render realistic math and physics in real time, like for video games and stuff, is intense. Whereas to program animations, like falling animations, initially on the design phase is more time consuming, but when it comes to processing power computation in the environment and the machine running the simulation or the game, depending on how you're looking at this, it is far easier to just execute animations, heuristics as it were, than to real-time process everything. Because it's like three-body problem, right? That's another example of the simulation argument in a sense. Everything is circumstantial. You'll have these things that say, well, I mean, nobody really knows, but I mean, yeah, but at the same time, everything that comes down to a real nobody really knows, somebody might know and they're just not telling you, which is itself a kind of simulation, in that your worldview is false because something somebody told you isn't true. But I'm talking more about how, like, quantum physics and relativity can't mesh. I'm talking about how, for some reason, we just cannot figure out how to calculate. Now, granted, I'm not a human supercomputer when it comes to math like that. I don't know calculus. But for whatever reason it is, we see three-body and more going on all the time. And we don't see a shitload of stars and black holes out in space just very occasionally we do. But most of the time, there is something going on that is obviously actually happening, but that we are unable to calculate. And so the idea being that every time you got three bodies orbiting, one of them is going to get tossed. But that doesn't always happen. In fact, we find lots of examples where that is not happening. Then there's things like the final parsec problem. If the universe itself is a simulation, it's got corner-cut rules to make things function smoothly for the purpose of the simulation, of running. At that point, there is no scientific truth being drawn from it. It is simply being able to watch a thing play out. But you see things like, theoretically, the space-time pinch in between two black holes is causally too steep to allow the two black holes to actually collide and combine. On top of the fact that there is a whole other shebang of like event horizons. There's two event horizons or more. There's a place where one event horizon crosses the other, and it's hypothetically, theoretically possible that something traveling within that, particles or energy or something, could just kind of pop back out the other side of the black hole due to passing through just the right spot. And that to me says that, number one, black holes, because quantum physics says singularities can exist and relativity says they should, and we've looked and we've seen things that behave in all the ways that relativity says should be singularities. But quantum singularities can't exist. And you'd have like wormholes that blow up the universe from inside. It'd be like the supernova bomb from Hitchhiker's Guide. Oh, sorry. Restaurant at the end of the earth. God, I'm so stupid. Life, the universe, and everything. Point being, it's one of those like wormholes connecting every black hole together, and even the little ones get puffed, and like it's nuts. Like you say, oh, that's absurd, right? Well, so here's the thing. In the real reality, maybe that is true, which is why in the real actuality, beyond whatever the simulation is, things like that probably don't exist. Maybe they're trying to figure out why. And it'd be hard for them to find the insight of like, okay, so we made them exist and they do this thing. Why can't they exist here? Well, because if they existed here, they would go and destroy everything, right? And on top of that, it's just possible that whatever the activity that goes on at that final parsec, the spike of space-time causality that they shouldn't be able to overcome, but they do, and then the two collide and combine and become one, is that maybe a universe forming as far as we know it from within? But there's so many things that we see, and it's not that we can't explain them, therefore they're proof. But they're things that, try as we might, they defy us. Those would be places where you're bumping up against truths that you within the simulation were never meant to even be aware of, let alone bump up against. Nothing is real. What you are looking at is a recreation of the image of me. It is not me. What I'm looking at as I'm recording this is a same digital reproduction of me. It is not me. There is a ever so slight lag between what I'm saying and how it's being presented on the screen. But individually, everyone should be aware of the fact that you cannot concretely prove that anything outside of your own body is real, because you can sense and feel the things in your own body through your central nervous system. And anything beyond that, you should not be able to be directly aware of unless all of your senses are working and nothing is obscured. But even that, what your senses are perceiving, what your mind is showing you, are not identical. Your senses are perceiving the entire spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. You're just only being shown certain parts. And what your mind shows you of what those certain parts illuminate are objects that we assign meaning to internally. But as objects, they are collections of energy condensed into material, particular mass or weight, volume, contents. But that's all internal. That's all in your head. There's like what what are they currently at, like 111 or 112 confirmed elements, all of which are just made up of protons and neutrons and electrons, the combinations of which, the positions within electron orbitals, all these things that are these nifty little mathematical coolnesses at this basic level that I believe are all hacks, corner cuts, so that the relativistic macroverse could function. Because the quantum is not the point, the macro is the point. But the macro is vast and enormous, and in this nearly infinite, bigger than we could ever explore, and even just the chunk that belongs to us is like 8 times bigger than we can see. That only exists big enough that the odds of at least one sentient, self-aware, potentially conscious race of life could just have evolved somewhere in the universe. And then that vast, enormous, bigger than we can be aware of thing, if we're the center and that's all there is, and it's really, in a sense, there for us, because causally it has to be there so that we can be here to observe it. Otherwise, it doesn't really need to exist. And going back to the very beginning, it is apparently a expansion into an existing cosmos of more cosmos, which I feel like is a cop-out to the fact that the simulation's got corner cuts. That if you take it's like you take the Grand Theft Auto universe, right, as a simulation, the characters within, if they were able to measure the physics of their universe and over time derive a theoretical idea of how things condense back to like the Big Bang kind of thing, what we look at the Big Bang is probably very wrong, because it's based on the logic and logistics of a universe with cut corners. And in so, I'm not sure that any of that information is relevant or valid, because it's like, okay, so you might as well go back to your religious stories about in the beginning the great programmer said, let there be the on light, and it was. And we completely just misunderstand everything because we cannot fully conceive of what actually is going on, because it's not as simple as a person turning on a device, I hope. Because, I mean, wouldn't it be terrible if, like, the entire cosmos and all life within it, including everyone that could potentially ever see this video, only existed because we are part of some kind of a weird virtual particle quantum jiggle of a butt plug of somebody else in another universe that vibrates? And, like, literally, like, that's all there is to it. That's the meaning of life. How horrifying, how amazingly terrible would that be? Because it's like, wait, so, like, we perceive that we have this planet and all these goofy politics and these people and the suffering and the weird moments of natural magic and joy and, like, domesticated cats, holy shit, dogs, like, snowball fights, that feeling you get on Christmas morning when you get something that you really wanted and there's, like, legit magic, just all about, right? All of that existing for the purpose of being part of the buzz of one time somebody used their vibrating butt plug in another cosmos that we might consider to be gods, but it's not really. And that's why I don't like nihilism. I don't get into that. It's dark. The only thing I take from it is the idea of don't stare too long into the void, it will stare back. You don't want to become that thing that you're, weary of. But all the same, when it comes to absurdism, when you get to the real questions of it, the things that seem to be the most, that can't be it, end up being the true things. So, when I say 26 times 36 equals 936, and then if you do that all in Hebrew, there's a weird joke going on there. And to say it's 100% true, you, the viewer, would say, I can't get behind that. That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. But I'm telling you, you get into absurdism. The more absurd a thing is, the more true it tends to be. I don't think it provides a single solitary iota of comfort or ability to make a difference or make a dent in the stupidity and fuckery of the world. Because most of it seems to be some kind of cut corner, heuristically designed contraption that either is meant to do its own retarded thing on its own, or it's supposed to keep others that are not simulated but exist within the same, superposition as the simulated in a sum. Is that containment? Is that it's not entertainment? That's for sure. But believe you me, that is the positive outcome. That is the better alternative. Because otherwise, it's what happens when the battery goes dead in that vibrating butt plug in that cosmic other universe.